On a cold December morning in 1872, the horizon stretched endlessly before Captain David Morehouse as he guided his merchant vessel Dei Gratia through the Atlantic waters between Portugal and Gibraltar. The sea was calm, almost eerily so, when his crew spotted something unusual in the distance. A ship drifted alone, her sails partially set but torn, moving without purpose through the gentle swells. As they drew closer, Morehouse recognized the vessel. It was the Mary Celeste, a merchant brigantine he knew well. Her captain, Benjamin Briggs, was not just a colleague but a friend, yet something was terribly wrong. The ship moved like a ghost across the water, responding only to wind and current with no sign of human presence aboard. Morehouse ordered his men to hail the vessel, their voices carrying across the water. No response came back. The Mary Celeste continued her silent drift, her rigging creaking softly in the breeze. After repeated attempts to make contact, Morehouse made the decision that would thrust this ordinary merchant ship into maritime legend. He ordered a boarding party to investigate. Chief Mate Oliver Deveau led 2 sailors across the choppy water in a small boat. As they climbed aboard the Mary Celeste, they entered what felt like a world frozen in time. The ship was completely abandoned, yet everything suggested the crew had vanished suddenly without warning or struggle. In the captain's cabin, Deveau found Briggs's personal belongings untouched. His clothes hung neatly in the wardrobe. The ship's papers were missing, but the logbook remained, its final entry dated 10 days earlier. The cargo hold contained 1,700 barrels of denatured alcohol, bound for Genoa. 9 barrels showed signs of damage, but the cargo was largely intact and accounted for. The galley told a story of interrupted daily life. Pots and pans sat where they had been left. Food remained in storage, though some provisions showed signs of water damage. Personal belongings of the crew lay scattered about their quarters, as if abandoned in haste yet without the chaos that would suggest panic or violence. Most puzzling of all, the ship's single lifeboat was missing, along with the navigation instruments and ship's papers. The compass had been damaged and water sloshed in the hold, though not enough to threaten the vessel's seaworthiness. The main hatch was open and several sails had been blown away or damaged, but the Mary Celeste remained entirely seaworthy. Captain Briggs had sailed from New York on November 7, 1872, with his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and a crew of 7 experienced sailors. The ship carried no passengers beyond the captain's family. All 10 souls aboard had simply vanished without explanation. Deveau's investigation revealed no signs of violence, no blood, no indication of struggle or piracy. The cargo was valuable enough to steal, yet it remained untouched. If pirates had boarded, why would they leave behind such wealth? If the crew had mutinied, where were the signs of conflict? The mystery deepened with every detail examined. Morehouse faced a difficult decision. Maritime law allowed him to claim the Mary Celeste as salvage, but doing so would inevitably raise suspicions about his involvement in whatever had happened. Nevertheless, he split his crew, sending Deveau and 2 sailors to sail the ghost ship to Gibraltar while he continued in the Dei Gratia. The salvage hearing in Gibraltar became a sensation. Officials suspected fraud, piracy, even murder. How else could an entire crew simply disappear from a seaworthy vessel? The investigation dragged on for months, but no evidence of wrongdoing emerged. The Mary Celeste's cargo was eventually delivered, and Morehouse received a modest salvage award, far less than he might have expected under normal circumstances. Theories about the Mary Celeste's fate began almost immediately and continue to this day. Some suggested the crew had been overcome by fumes from the damaged alcohol barrels. Denatured alcohol can produce toxic vapors, and an experienced captain might order evacuation if he feared explosion or poisoning. Perhaps they took to the lifeboat intending to return once the danger passed, only to be swept away by currents or overwhelmed by rough weather. Others proposed that seismic activity might have caused the crew to panic. The Mediterranean region experiences earthquakes, and tremors at sea can create terrifying but harmless phenomena. Water might spout from the ship's seams, deck cargo might shift dramatically, and the vessel might shudder as if breaking apart, all while remaining fundamentally sound. A captain unfamiliar with such events might order immediate abandonment. Piracy remained a possibility, though the undisturbed cargo argued against it. Perhaps raiders had taken the crew as slaves or hostages, planning to return for the valuable alcohol. Political tensions in the Mediterranean could have made any vessel a target for desperate men, though again, the lack of violence or theft seemed inconsistent with typical pirate behavior. The mutiny theory suggested that Captain Briggs's crew had turned against him, perhaps planning to steal the cargo and sell it privately, but mutineers would likely have sailed the ship to a friendly port rather than abandoning it at sea. The presence of Briggs's wife and child also made mutiny less probable, as sailors traditionally respected women and children aboard ship. More exotic theories emerged as the story spread. Some claimed the Mary Celeste had encountered supernatural forces or sea monsters. Others suggested experimental weapons or natural phenomena unknown to science. These explanations reflected humanity's eternal fascination with the unexplained rather than serious investigation. The damaged compass sparked theories about magnetic anomalies or electrical phenomena. The Atlantic shipping lanes cross regions where magnetic variations can affect navigation instruments. Perhaps some unknown force had disabled the ship's navigation, leading to confusion and panic among the crew, yet experienced sailors could navigate by stars and sun, making such explanations less convincing. Weather records from December 1872 show storms in the Atlantic around the time the Mary Celeste was found. Perhaps Captain Briggs had encountered severe weather that damaged his ship and prompted evacuation. The missing lifeboat suggested the crew had left voluntarily rather than being taken by force. Small boats stood little chance in winter Atlantic storms, which could explain why no trace of the missing people was ever found. The Mary Celeste herself continued sailing for years after her mysterious discovery. Sold and resold multiple times, she carried various cargoes across Atlantic routes. Each new owner hoped to profit from her notoriety, but the ship seemed cursed with misfortune. Accidents, fires, and financial losses plagued her subsequent voyages, as if the mystery that made her famous had also doomed her to perpetual trouble. In 1885, the Mary Celeste met her end off the coast of Haiti. Her final captain, Gilman Parker, deliberately wrecked her on a coral reef in an insurance fraud scheme. Parker hoped to collect money for both ship and cargo, but investigators exposed his plot. The ghost ship's last voyage ended not in mystery but in mundane criminality, a fitting end to her troubled later years. The Mary Celeste mystery endures because it embodies our deepest fears about the sea. The ocean remains vast and largely unknown, capable of swallowing ships and souls without explanation. In an age when technology seemed to promise mastery over nature, the Mary Celeste reminded people that some forces remain beyond human understanding or control. Modern investigators have applied scientific analysis to the century-old mystery, but definitive answers remain elusive. Chemical analysis of the alcohol cargo confirms that toxic fumes could have prompted evacuation. Weather data supports theories about sudden storms or seismic events, yet no single explanation accounts for all the evidence found aboard the abandoned ship. The Mary Celeste represents something more than a maritime mystery. She symbolizes the limits of human knowledge and the persistence of the unknown in our ordered world. Her story continues to inspire books, films, and investigations because it touches something fundamental about our relationship with the sea and our fear of vanishing without trace or explanation. As we move from this tale of eerie silence and unexplained disappearance, we turn next to a very different kind of maritime disaster. Where the Mary Celeste drifted peacefully through calm waters, our next story unfolds in flames and chaos, as fire turns a luxury liner into a floating inferno off the coast of New Jersey. The luxury liner SS Morro Castle cut through the dark Atlantic waters on the night of September 7, 1934, her passengers settling into their staterooms after another evening of dancing and dining. The ship represented the height of maritime elegance, a floating palace that carried wealthy Americans between New York and Havana on weekly pleasure cruises. Her Art Deco interiors gleamed with polished wood and brass, while her restaurant served the finest cuisine available at sea. Captain Robert Wilmot had commanded the Morro Castle for years, earning respect for his steady leadership and attention to safety. But as the ship steamed northward toward New York on this particular voyage, Wilmot lay gravely ill in his cabin, suffering from what appeared to be severe stomach problems. The responsibility for the ship's safe passage fell increasingly to his officers as the captain's condition worsened through the night. Shortly after midnight on September 8th, tragedy struck twice in rapid succession. Captain Wilmot died suddenly in his cabin, leaving the crew stunned and uncertain. Chief Officer William Worms assumed command, but within hours he would face a crisis that would test every aspect of his leadership and seamanship skills. At 2:45 in the morning, a passenger reported smoke in the first-class writing room. The night watchman investigated and found flames spreading rapidly through the elegant lounge area. The fire had already gained considerable strength, feeding on the ship's wooden furnishings, fabric decorations, and varnished surfaces that turned the luxurious interior into perfect fuel for disaster. The Morro Castle's fire detection and suppression systems proved woefully inadequate. The ship lacked modern fire doors, automatic sprinkler systems, or effective compartmentalization that might have contained the blaze. Built in 1930, she represented older design philosophies that prioritized passenger comfort over safety considerations that would later become standard. Acting Captain Worms faced an impossible situation. The fire spread with terrifying speed through the ship's superstructure, driven by strong winds that turned the vessel into a giant torch. The crew's attempts to fight the flames proved futile as the blaze consumed corridor after corridor, trapping passengers in their staterooms and cutting off escape routes. Panic spread as quickly as the fire itself. Passengers awakened to smoke-filled corridors and the terrifying realization that their floating paradise had become a death trap. Many found themselves trapped above the flames with no way to reach the boat deck. Others jumped directly into the cold Atlantic waters, preferring the ocean's dangers to the certainty of death by fire. The ship's crew performed unevenly during the crisis. Some officers and sailors showed remarkable courage, helping passengers to safety and organizing evacuation efforts. Others seemed paralyzed by the disaster's magnitude or focused primarily on their own survival. The breakdown in command structure following Captain Wilmot's death contributed to confusion and delayed response. Radio operator George Rogers became an unlikely hero during the disaster. Working in increasingly smoke-filled conditions, he continued transmitting distress signals even as flames approached his equipment. His persistent efforts alerted nearby ships and shore stations to the Morro Castle's desperate situation, ultimately saving many lives through coordinated rescue efforts. The evacuation revealed serious flaws in both equipment and procedures. Many lifeboats proved difficult to launch in the rough seas and strong winds. Some boats capsized immediately upon hitting the water, throwing their occupants into the ocean. Others launched only partially filled because crew members lacked proper training in evacuation procedures under emergency conditions. Coast Guard vessels responded quickly to the distress calls, racing through the darkness toward the burning ship's position. The rescue operation became a desperate race against time as the fire consumed more of the vessel and drove increasing numbers of people into the water. Searchlights swept the ocean surface, seeking survivors among the waves. The passenger ship City of Savannah arrived first among the rescue vessels, her crew immediately beginning to pull survivors from the water. Other ships joined the effort as dawn broke, revealing the full scope of the disaster. The Morro Castle continued burning as rescue operations proceeded, her superstructure now a twisted mass of metal and ash. Shore-based rescue efforts mobilized along the New Jersey coast as currents and winds pushed the burning hulk toward land. Beach communities organized volunteer rescue teams, while Coast Guard stations prepared to receive survivors. The disaster became a community-wide emergency as residents opened their homes to rescued passengers and crew members. The death toll reached 137 people, making the Morro Castle fire one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in American waters. Many victims died not from the flames themselves, but from smoke inhalation or drowning after jumping into the rough seas. The tragedy shocked a nation that had grown confident in the safety of modern passenger ships. Investigation into the fire's cause began immediately, but reaching definitive conclusions proved difficult. The intense heat had destroyed much physical evidence, leaving investigators to piece together the disaster's origins from witness testimony and the burned wreckage that remained. Several theories emerged, each with supporting evidence but none entirely conclusive. Sabotage became the most controversial explanation for the fire's origin. George White Alana, a crew member with a criminal background, fell under suspicion when investigators learned of his presence in the writing room area shortly before the fire was discovered. Alagna had been convicted of arson in the past, and some witnesses reported seeing him acting suspiciously on the night of the disaster. The sabotage theory gained credibility from the fire's unusual behavior. Witnesses described how the flames seemed to spread in multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting the possibility of multiple ignition points. The rapid spread through the ship's ventilation system also seemed consistent with deliberately set fires designed to cause maximum damage and confusion. However, investigators also found evidence supporting accidental causes. The ship's electrical system showed signs of problems that could have created sparks or overheating. Smoking materials carelessly discarded in the writing room could have ignited furniture or decorations. The combination of dry conditions and flammable materials throughout the ship made accidental ignition entirely plausible. Weather conditions on the night of the fire contributed significantly to the disaster's severity regardless of its cause. Strong winds fanned the flames and made firefighting efforts nearly impossible. The same winds that spread the fire also complicated evacuation procedures and rescue operations, turning what might have been a manageable emergency into a major catastrophe. The Morro Castle investigation revealed serious deficiencies in maritime safety regulations. The ship met all existing legal requirements for fire safety equipment and procedures, yet proved completely inadequate when faced with a real emergency. This gap between regulation and reality prompted calls for comprehensive reform of passenger ship safety standards. Congress responded to the disaster with new legislation requiring improved fire detection systems, better evacuation equipment, and enhanced crew training. The changes mandated automatic fire doors, improved sprinkler systems, and regular safety drills for both passengers and crew members. These reforms, though coming too late for the Morro Castle's victims, would prevent similar disasters in the future. The burned hulk of the Morro Castle eventually grounded near Asbury Park, New Jersey, where she became a temporary tourist attraction. Thousands of visitors came to see the charred remains of the once magnificent liner, a grim reminder of how quickly luxury could turn to tragedy. The wreck was eventually scrapped, but memories of the disaster continued to influence ship design and safety procedures. Radio operator George Rogers received widespread recognition for his heroic efforts during the disaster, though later investigations would raise questions about his role in the ship's problems. Some evidence suggested Rogers might have been involved in earlier incidents aboard the Morro Castle, including possible sabotage attempts that preceded the fatal fire. The Morro Castle disaster marked a turning point in public confidence in passenger ship travel. Coming just 22 years after the Titanic tragedy, the fire demonstrated that maritime disasters could still occur despite advances in technology and safety awareness. The lessons learned from both tragedies would shape ship design and safety procedures for generations to come. As we leave behind the flames and chaos of the Morro Castle, our next journey takes us to Canadian waters and a collision that unfolded with even more devastating speed. In the cold waters of the St. Lawrence River, another passenger liner would meet disaster in mere minutes, earning the tragic distinction of being proportionally deadlier than even the famous Titanic. The majestic RMS Empress of Ireland glided through the calm waters of the St. Lawrence River on the evening of May 28, 1914, her passengers settling in for what should have been a peaceful crossing to Liverpool. The Canadian Pacific Railway's flagship liner carried over 1,400 souls that night, from wealthy first-class travelers in elegant staterooms to hopeful immigrants seeking new lives across the Atlantic. Captain Henry Kendall stood on his bridge as darkness fell over the river, satisfied with his ship's progress and the favorable weather conditions. The Empress of Ireland represented the pinnacle of Edwardian maritime engineering, a floating city complete with luxurious dining rooms, smoking lounges, and promenade decks where passengers could stroll and enjoy the river scenery. The ship had departed Quebec City that afternoon with 1,057 passengers and 420 crew members aboard. Among the travelers were members of the Salvation Army heading to a conference in London, families emigrating to Britain, and business travelers conducting affairs between Canada and Europe. The passenger manifest read like a cross-section of early 20th century society. As the evening progressed, a thick fog began to roll in from the Atlantic, gradually reducing visibility along the river. Captain Kendall ordered reduced speed and posted extra lookouts, standard precautions when navigating in poor visibility. The fog grew denser as the night wore on, eventually becoming so thick that lights from shore became barely visible ghostly glows in the distance. At approximately 1:30 in the morning on May 29th, lookouts aboard the Empress spotted the lights of another vessel approaching from the opposite direction. Through the fog, they could make out the silhouette of a ship moving upriver toward Quebec City. The vessel was later identified as the Norwegian collier SS Storstad, carrying coal from Nova Scotia under the command of Captain Thomas Anderson. What happened next would unfold with tragic swiftness, a cascade of miscommunication and misjudgment that would send the Empress of Ireland to the bottom of the St. Lawrence River in just 14 minutes. The collision between these two ships would become one of the deadliest maritime disasters in Canadian history, yet it remains overshadowed by the Titanic tragedy that had occurred just 2 years earlier. Captain Kendall, observing the approaching vessel's lights, believed the ships would pass safely port to port, the standard practice for vessels meeting in a channel. He maintained his course, expecting the Storstad to do likewise. However, the fog played tricks with distance and direction, making it difficult for either captain to accurately judge the other ship's position and heading. Captain Anderson aboard the Storstad apparently misinterpreted the Empress's intentions and movements in the fog. Norwegian maritime practice differed slightly from British customs, and the language barrier may have contributed to confusion when the ships attempted to signal their intentions. Radio communication was not yet standard for ship-to-ship coordination, leaving only whistle signals and visual cues to coordinate passage. As the vessels drew closer, both captains realized something was wrong. The ships were not passing safely as expected, but were instead on a collision course. Frantic whistle signals echoed through the fog as both crews attempted to avoid disaster. Engines reversed and helms turned hard over, but the massive ships carried too much momentum to stop or change direction quickly enough. The Storstad's reinforced bow, designed for ice navigation, struck the Empress of Ireland on her starboard side near the engine room. The impact tore a massive gash in the passenger liner's hull below the waterline, instantly flooding several compartments. The collision's force threw passengers from their beds and sent crew members scrambling to assess the damage. Water poured into the Empress through the enormous breach in her hull. The ship's designers had incorporated watertight compartments intended to prevent sinking, but the damage proved too extensive for these safety measures. The angle of the collision and the size of the opening overwhelmed the vessel's ability to contain the flooding. Captain Kendall immediately ordered distress signals sent and began evacuation procedures, but the ship's list to starboard developed with terrifying speed. Within minutes, the Empress had tilted so severely that launching lifeboats from the port side became impossible. Many boats on the starboard side were either damaged by the collision or couldn't be lowered because of the ship's increasing angle. The disaster unfolded in darkness and confusion, with passengers and crew having little time to react to the emergency. Many people were trapped in their cabins as corridors flooded, and the ship's severe list made movement nearly impossible. The vessel's electric lighting failed as water reached the generators, plunging much of the ship into complete darkness. Those who managed to reach the deck found themselves facing a desperate choice between staying aboard a rapidly sinking ship or jumping into the cold St. Lawrence River. The water temperature in late May was still dangerously cold, capable of causing hypothermia within minutes. Life jackets were scarce, and many passengers had no time to retrieve them from their cabins. The Salvation Army members aboard faced the disaster with remarkable courage and faith. Witnesses later reported seeing them gathered on deck, singing hymns and praying together as the ship sank beneath them. 167 Salvation Army personnel perished in the disaster, a loss that deeply affected the organization's operations in Canada. Captain Kendall remained on his bridge until the last possible moment, coordinating rescue efforts and ensuring that distress signals continued to transmit. As the ship took her final plunge, he was thrown into the water but managed to survive by clinging to wreckage until rescued. His testimony would prove crucial in the subsequent investigation into the collision's causes. The SS Storstad, though badly damaged in the collision, remained afloat and immediately began rescue operations. Her crew lowered boats and pulled survivors from the water, working frantically in the darkness to save as many lives as possible. Other vessels responded to the distress calls, but the Empress sank so quickly that rescue efforts could save only a fraction of those aboard. The final death toll reached 1,012 people, making the Empress of Ireland disaster proportionally deadlier than the Titanic. While the famous White Star liner had carried over 2,000 people and lost 1,500, the Empress carried fewer passengers but lost a higher percentage of those aboard. Yet this Canadian tragedy received far less attention than its more famous predecessor. Several factors contributed to the disaster's severity and high casualty rate. The collision occurred at night when most passengers were asleep and unprepared for emergency evacuation. The fog that obscured the initial collision also hampered rescue efforts, making it difficult for rescue vessels to locate survivors in the water. The ship's rapid sinking gave passengers and crew minimal time to organize an effective evacuation. Unlike the Titanic, which took nearly 3 hours to sink, the Empress went down in just 14 minutes. This brief time frame meant that many people had no opportunity to reach lifeboats or even put on life jackets before the ship disappeared beneath the surface. The Empress of Ireland's design, while advanced for its time, proved inadequate for the type of damage inflicted by the collision. The ship's watertight compartments could handle flooding in 1 or 2 sections, but not the massive breach created by the Storstad's ice-reinforced bow. Modern ship design would later incorporate lessons learned from both the Titanic and Empress disasters. Investigation into the collision began immediately, with both Canadian and Norwegian authorities conducting separate inquiries. The proceedings revealed conflicting testimony from the 2 captains about the circumstances leading to the collision. Language barriers, different maritime traditions, and the fog's effects on visibility made determining precise fault extremely difficult. Captain Kendall maintained that he had followed proper procedures and that the Storstad had changed course unexpectedly, causing the collision. Captain Anderson insisted that his actions were appropriate and that the Empress had altered her course in a dangerous manner. Both men were experienced mariners with good records, making the conflicting accounts even more puzzling. The investigation ultimately placed primary blame on the Storstad, finding that Captain Anderson had made errors in judgment that led to the collision. However, the inquiry also noted that both ships could have taken additional precautions given the foggy conditions. The disaster highlighted the need for better communication protocols and navigation procedures in limited visibility. Weather conditions played a crucial role in both causing and worsening the disaster. The fog that led to the collision also hampered rescue efforts, making it difficult for survivors to be spotted in the water. The cold river temperature claimed many lives even among those who initially survived the sinking, emphasizing the importance of rapid rescue in northern waters. The Empress of Ireland disaster had lasting impacts on maritime safety regulations, particularly regarding navigation in reduced visibility. New requirements for fog signals, radar equipment, and communication procedures were gradually implemented to prevent similar collisions. These changes would save countless lives in future decades as shipping traffic increased. The tragedy also highlighted the vulnerability of passenger ships to collision damage. Unlike fire or mechanical failure, which typically develop gradually, collision damage can be instantaneous and catastrophic. Ship designers began incorporating better subdivision and damage control features to improve survivability in collision scenarios. The wreck of the Empress of Ireland remains on the bottom of the St. Lawrence River, lying in 130 feet of water. The site has become a popular destination for experienced divers, though the cold water and strong currents make exploration challenging. Artifacts recovered from the wreck provide poignant reminders of the lives lost in those dark waters. Unlike the Titanic, whose story has been told countless times in books and films, the Empress of Ireland remains largely forgotten outside of Canada. This obscurity seems particularly tragic given the disaster's scale and the lessons it provided about maritime safety. The ship's story deserves remembrance alongside other great maritime tragedies. The families and communities affected by the Empress disaster grieved largely in private, without the worldwide attention that followed the Titanic's sinking. The Salvation Army's losses were particularly devastating, wiping out much of the organization's Canadian leadership and disrupting its charitable work for years afterward. As we leave the cold waters of the St. Lawrence River where the Empress of Ireland found her grave, our journey continues to warmer seas but no less tragic circumstances. In the Mediterranean waters off Nantucket, another collision would unfold in thick fog, this time involving one of Italy's most prestigious ocean liners and demonstrating that even modern radar technology could not always prevent maritime disaster. The elegant Andrea Doria cut through the Atlantic swells on the evening of July 25, 1956, her passengers enjoying what had been a perfect summer crossing from Genoa to New York. The Italian liner represented the pinnacle of post-war maritime design, a floating showcase of Italian artistry and engineering that had restored national pride after the devastation of the Second World War. Captain Piero Calamai stood on his bridge as evening approached, reviewing weather reports and navigation charts for the final approach to New York Harbor. The Andrea Doria carried 1,706 souls that night, including crew members who took immense pride in serving aboard Italy's flagship passenger vessel. The ship's reputation for luxury, safety, and punctual service had made her one of the most sought-after ways to cross the Atlantic. As darkness fell over the ocean, a familiar hazard began to develop along the northeastern coast of the United States. Fog banks formed when warm Gulf Stream waters met cold Labrador current air masses started rolling across the shipping lanes approaching New York. These fog conditions were common during summer months, but they transformed the busy sea lanes into treacherous passages where even experienced captains proceeded with extreme caution. The Andrea Doria carried the most advanced navigation equipment available in 1956, including radar systems that could detect other vessels through fog and darkness. Captain Calamai had confidence in both his equipment and his crew's ability to navigate safely through the deteriorating visibility. The ship maintained her scheduled speed, eager to reach New York on time after the 9-day voyage from Italy. Unknown to those aboard the Andrea Doria, another vessel was approaching through the same fog bank from the opposite direction. The Swedish-American liner MS Stockholm, under command of Captain Harry Gunnar Nordenson, was beginning her outbound voyage to Gothenburg with 539 passengers and crew aboard. The Stockholm represented Scandinavian maritime traditions, built for North Atlantic service with ice-strengthened construction and reliable navigation equipment. Both ships carried experienced officers who understood the dangers of fog navigation. Radar operators on each vessel tracked approaching contacts on their screens, plotting courses and speeds to ensure safe passage. However, the radar technology of 1956, while revolutionary, required careful interpretation and could be subject to errors that modern systems have largely eliminated. As the two ships drew closer in the thickening fog, a series of miscommunications and misjudgments began to unfold. The radar operators aboard each vessel tracked the other ship's approach, but different interpretations of the radar displays led to conflicting assessments of the situation. What should have been a routine passing became a deadly game of confusion played out in near-zero visibility. Captain Calamai, reviewing radar information from his officers, believed the approaching vessel would pass safely to port. Standard maritime practice called for ships to pass port to port when meeting head-on, and the radar contacts seemed to confirm this assumption. The Andrea Doria maintained her course and speed, confident that the other vessel would do likewise. Aboard the Stockholm, Third Officer Johan Ernst Carstens Johansson was navigating the ship while Captain Nordenson rested in his cabin. Johansson interpreted his radar differently, believing the approaching ship would pass to starboard. This fundamental disagreement about which side the ships would pass on created a dangerous situation where each vessel expected the other to take action that never came. The fog grew thicker as the ships approached each other, reducing visibility to near zero. Traditional visual navigation became impossible, leaving only radar and dead reckoning to guide the massive vessels through the darkness. Radio communication between ships was not yet standard practice for navigation coordination, leaving each captain to interpret the situation based on limited information. At approximately 11:10 in the evening, the two ships suddenly burst through the fog into a clear patch where they could see each other for the first time. Both vessels were much closer than either captain had realized, and they were not passing safely as expected, but were instead on a collision course. Frantic orders echoed across both bridges as crews attempted to avoid the inevitable impact. The Stockholm, with her ice-reinforced bow designed for polar navigation, struck the Andrea Doria on her starboard side, penetrating deep into the Italian liner's hull. The collision occurred with tremendous force, instantly killing several passengers in the Stockholm's crushed bow section while tearing a massive gash in the Andrea Doria's side that extended well below the waterline. The impact threw passengers from their beds throughout both ships, creating immediate chaos and confusion. Emergency alarms began sounding as crew members rushed to assess the damage and begin evacuation procedures. The Andrea Doria took on an immediate list to starboard as thousands of tons of seawater poured through the breach in her hull. Captain Calamai quickly realized his ship was doomed. The collision had damaged multiple watertight compartments, and the vessel's list made it impossible to launch lifeboats from the port side. The Andrea Doria's design included modern safety features, but the location and extent of the damage overwhelmed her ability to remain afloat. The Stockholm, though badly damaged in the bow with several crew members killed, remained seaworthy and immediately began rescue operations. Captain Nordenson, awakened by the collision, took personal command of efforts to save lives from both vessels. The Swedish liner's survival proved fortunate, as she would play a crucial role in the evacuation of the Andrea Doria's passengers and crew. Radio distress calls went out immediately, alerting ships throughout the region to the disaster. The busy North Atlantic shipping lanes meant several vessels were within range to assist, including the French liner Île-de-France, which had departed New York that same evening. These rescue ships would prove vital in preventing the collision from becoming an even greater tragedy. The evacuation of the Andrea Doria became a race against time as the ship's list increased steadily. Passengers gathered on deck in their nightclothes, many having been thrown from their beds by the collision's impact. Crew members worked heroically to launch lifeboats from the high side while helping passengers overcome their fear of descending into the dark ocean. The ship's severe list created extraordinary challenges for evacuation procedures. Lifeboats that should have lowered smoothly instead swung dangerously against the hull, threatening to crush passengers attempting to board. Some boats capsized upon launching, throwing their occupants into the water where rescue ships had to fish them out. Captain Calamai remained on his bridge coordinating the evacuation, following the maritime tradition that the captain must be the last to leave his ship. As the Andrea Doria's list increased beyond 45 degrees, normal movement aboard became nearly impossible. Passengers and crew had to climb uphill across tilted decks to reach the few remaining usable lifeboats. The rescue operation became one of the largest coordinated maritime rescue efforts in history. Multiple ships converged on the disaster site, including Coast Guard vessels, merchant ships, and private boats. Helicopters provided additional assistance, lifting survivors from life rafts and providing aerial coordination of the rescue fleet. The French liner Île-de-France arrived early in the rescue operation and immediately began taking aboard survivors from the Andrea Doria's lifeboats. Her crew worked through the night, providing medical attention, warm clothing, and comfort to passengers who had lost everything when their ship was struck. The international cooperation displayed during the rescue reflected the maritime community's commitment to saving lives at sea. As dawn broke over the Atlantic, the Andrea Doria continued her death spiral into the ocean. The beautiful liner, once the pride of the Italian merchant marine, lay on her side like a wounded whale. Photographers and cameramen aboard rescue vessels documented the ship's final moments, creating some of the most dramatic maritime disaster images ever captured. At 10:09 in the morning on July 26th, 11 hours after the collision, the Andrea Doria slipped beneath the surface and disappeared into 240 feet of water. The ship's end marked not just the loss of a magnificent vessel, but also the symbolic conclusion of the golden age of transatlantic passenger liner service. The final casualty count reached 46 deaths, a remarkably low number considering the severity of the collision and the challenges faced during evacuation. The successful rescue of over 1,600 people demonstrated both the value of modern communication systems and the heroism of mariners who risked their own safety to save others. Investigation into the collision revealed a complex web of factors that contributed to the disaster. Radar interpretation errors, different navigation practices between Italian and Swedish maritime traditions, and communication failures all played roles in the tragedy. The inquiry highlighted the need for standardized international procedures for radar navigation and ship-to-ship communication. The collision occurred during the early years of marine radar technology, when operators were still learning to interpret the new electronic displays. Both ships had radar equipment, but the systems required considerable skill to operate effectively. Operator error and equipment limitations contributed to the misunderstanding about each ship's intended course. Weather conditions, while not directly causing the collision, significantly complicated both the navigation and rescue operations. The fog that obscured visual navigation also made it difficult for rescue vessels to coordinate their efforts and locate survivors in the water. Clear weather might have allowed the ships to see each other in time to avoid collision entirely. The Andrea Doria disaster marked a turning point in ocean liner travel, occurring just as commercial aviation was beginning to challenge ships for passenger service. The collision demonstrated that even the most modern vessels remained vulnerable to human error and natural hazards. Many passengers who might have chosen ship travel opted for the emerging jet aircraft instead. The wreck of the Andrea Doria became famous among deep-sea divers as one of the most challenging and dangerous diving sites in the world. The ship's depth, strong currents, and deteriorating structure have claimed the lives of several divers over the decades, yet the wreck continues to attract explorers seeking artifacts and attempting to solve remaining mysteries about the disaster. Artifacts recovered from the Andrea Doria provide poignant reminders of the elegant lifestyle that ended so abruptly on that foggy night. Fine china, artwork, and personal belongings scattered across the ocean floor tell the story of passengers whose luxury voyage became a desperate fight for survival. The disaster also highlighted the importance of international cooperation in maritime safety. The rescue operation involved vessels from multiple nations working together seamlessly to save lives. This cooperation would later influence the development of international maritime rescue coordination systems that continue to save lives today. As we leave the fog-shrouded waters where the Andrea Doria met her fate, our journey takes us back in time to an even more famous maritime disaster. The collision off Nantucket demonstrated that modern technology could not always prevent tragedy, but our next story unfolds in an era when such technology did not yet exist, and human hubris met the raw power of nature in the form of an iceberg. The RMS Titanic steamed through the calm North Atlantic waters on the night of April 14, 1912, her passengers and crew confident in the invincibility of their magnificent vessel. The White Star Line's newest flagship represented the pinnacle of Edwardian engineering and luxury, a floating palace that seemed to embody humanity's triumph over the forces of nature. At 882 feet long and weighing over 46,000 tons, she was the largest moving object ever built by human hands. Captain Edward Smith commanded the Titanic on what was intended to be his final voyage before retirement. Known as the Millionaire's Captain for his skill in handling luxury liners and wealthy passengers, Smith had an impeccable safety record spanning 4 decades at sea. The ship carried 2,224 souls that night, from the wealthiest industrialists and socialites in first class to hopeful immigrants seeking new lives in America. The ship's designers had incorporated revolutionary safety features that earned her the nickname practically unsinkable. 16 watertight compartments divided the hull, with electrically operated doors that could seal off damaged sections within seconds. The ship could supposedly survive flooding in any 4 compartments, a level of protection that exceeded anything required by maritime regulations of the time. As the evening progressed, wireless operators aboard the Titanic received multiple ice warnings from other ships in the area. The winter of 1911 to 1912 had been unusually mild, causing icebergs to drift further south than normal into the busy North Atlantic shipping lanes. Ships throughout the region reported encountering ice fields and individual bergs drifting in the path of westbound vessels. Captain Smith was aware of the ice reports but chose to maintain the ship's speed of approximately 22 knots. This decision reflected common practice among passenger liner captains who faced enormous pressure to maintain schedules and arrive in port on time. Slowing down would delay the ship's arrival in New York and disappoint passengers eager to complete their journey. The night was exceptionally calm and clear, with no moon and unusually still water that created perfect conditions for spotting icebergs under normal circumstances. However, these same conditions proved treacherous because they eliminated the usual white foam that forms around the base of icebergs when waves break against them. Without this telltale foam, icebergs became nearly invisible against the dark sky. Lookouts. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee stood watch in the crow's nest high above the ship's bridge, scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. The lookouts had requested binoculars but were told none were available, forcing them to rely on their naked eyes to spot hazards in the darkness. This seemingly minor equipment shortage would prove to have tragic consequences. At 11:39 in the evening, Fleet spotted what appeared to be a dark mass directly ahead of the ship. He immediately rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge with the urgent message, "Iceberg right ahead." First Officer William Murdoch, who had command of the bridge while Captain Smith rested, ordered the engines reversed and the helm turned hard to port in a desperate attempt to avoid collision. The Titanic began to respond to these emergency maneuvers, her massive bulk slowly starting to turn away from the iceberg. For a moment it seemed the ship might clear the obstacle entirely. However, the vessel's enormous size and momentum made quick course changes impossible. Despite the crew's efforts, the iceberg scraped along the ship's starboard side below the waterline. The collision felt surprisingly gentle to most passengers and crew. Many described it as a slight vibration or grinding sensation rather than a violent impact. Some passengers on deck reported seeing chunks of ice fall onto the forward well deck, but the encounter seemed so minor that many people remained in their cabins, unaware that their ship had just suffered fatal damage. Below the waterline, the iceberg had opened a series of punctures and gashes along the ship's hull, flooding the first 6 compartments. The damage extended beyond the ship's ability to survive, dooming the unsinkable vessel to a slow but inevitable death. Water poured through the breaches at a rate of over 7 tons per second, overwhelming the pumps and gradually pulling the ship down by the head. Captain Smith, summoned to the bridge immediately after the collision, quickly grasped the severity of the situation. Ship's designer Thomas Andrews, who happened to be aboard for the maiden voyage, conducted a rapid damage assessment and delivered devastating news. The flooding had compromised too many compartments for the ship to remain afloat. Andrews estimated the Titanic had perhaps an hour and a half before she would sink completely. The ship's wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, began transmitting distress calls using both the new SOS signal and the older CQD emergency code. Their messages reached ships throughout the North Atlantic, but the nearest vessel capable of mounting a rescue, the RMS Carpathia, was over 50 miles away and would require nearly 4 hours to reach the disaster site. The evacuation of the Titanic became a tragic exercise in class distinction and maritime tradition. The protocol of women and children first was followed, but implementation varied dramatically between different areas of the ship. First and second class passengers had easier access to boat stations and received more assistance from crew members, while many third class passengers found themselves trapped below decks by locked gates and confusing corridors. The ship carried only enough lifeboats for about half the people aboard, a number that exceeded legal requirements but proved tragically inadequate. This shortage reflected regulations that had not kept pace with increasing ship sizes based on outdated assumptions about rescue operations and the ship's own ability to serve as a lifeboat until help arrived. Many lifeboats were launched only partially filled due to confusion about their capacity and fears that they might buckle under full loads. Boat 7, with a capacity of 65 people, left the ship with only 27 aboard. This inefficient use of available lifeboat space cost hundreds of additional lives that might have been saved with better organization and training. As the night progressed, the Titanic's bow sank deeper into the water while her stern rose higher into the air. The ship's lights continued burning almost until the end, maintained by heroic engineers who remained at their posts to keep power flowing. The ship's band famously continued playing music on deck, helping to maintain calm among passengers waiting for evacuation. The ship's final moments began shortly after 2 in the morning when the angle of her bow became so severe that massive structural stresses began tearing the hull apart. With a tremendous roar of escaping air and collapsing steel, the Titanic broke in 2 between the 3rd and 4th funnels. The bow section, completely flooded, disappeared immediately into the depths. The stern section remained afloat for a few more minutes, settling back into the water before taking on a nearly vertical position and plunging into the ocean. At 2:20 in the morning on April 15, 1912, the largest and most luxurious ship in the world vanished beneath the surface, leaving over 1,500 people struggling in the freezing North Atlantic water. The water temperature, approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit, proved as deadly as the sinking itself. Most people who entered the water died of hypothermia within 15 to 30 minutes, despite being strong swimmers or wearing life jackets. The few lifeboats in the area picked up only a handful of survivors from the water, leaving hundreds to perish within sight of safety. The RMS Carpathia arrived at the disaster site just before 4 in the morning, her crew immediately beginning the heartbreaking task of searching for survivors. They found only lifeboats scattered across the calm sea, carrying 705 survivors from the over 2,000 people who had been aboard the Titanic. The ship's lights, which had seemed so indestructible just hours before, had vanished completely beneath the waves. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia organized one of the most efficient rescue operations in maritime history, despite arriving too late to save the ship. His crew provided medical attention, warm clothing, and comfort to traumatized survivors while documenting the disaster for investigation. The rescue ship's wireless operators transmitted survivor lists that would bring either relief or devastating news to families around the world. The disaster's impact extended far beyond the immediate loss of life. The Titanic had carried some of the wealthiest and most prominent people in the world, including business magnates, politicians, and socialites whose deaths shocked international society. The ship's sinking also claimed hundreds of working-class passengers and crew members, highlighting the period's stark social divisions. Investigation into the disaster began immediately, with both British and American inquiries examining every aspect of the tragedy. The investigations revealed multiple factors that contributed to the catastrophe, from inadequate lifeboat regulations and ice warning procedures to the ship's speed in dangerous conditions and the nearby SS Californian's failure to respond to distress signals. The disaster fundamentally changed maritime safety regulations worldwide. The first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea was convened in 1914, establishing new requirements for lifeboat capacity, 24-hour radio watches, and ice patrol services. These reforms, written in the blood of the Titanic's victims, would prevent countless future tragedies. The ship's wreck remained undiscovered for 73 years, lying in 12,500 feet of water on the ocean floor. When Robert Ballard located the wreck in 1985, he found the ship broken in 2 pieces, confirming survivor accounts of the ship's final breakup. The discovery sparked renewed interest in the disaster and debates about salvage rights and memorial preservation. Artifacts recovered from the wreck site provide poignant connections to the individual stories of those who sailed aboard the ship. Personal belongings, ship's equipment, and pieces of the vessel itself tell the human story behind the statistics, reminding us that each casualty represented a unique life with dreams, fears, and loved ones left behind. The Titanic disaster has become a cultural touchstone, inspiring countless books, films, and documentaries that examine both the technical aspects of the sinking and the human drama that unfolded on that April night. The story continues to fascinate new generations because it combines elements of technological hubris, social inequality, heroism, and tragedy that resonate across time. The ship's legacy extends beyond entertainment and remembrance to ongoing improvements in maritime safety. Modern ships carry sophisticated ice detection equipment, satellite communication systems, and sufficient lifeboats for everyone aboard. These advances trace their lineage directly to lessons learned from the Titanic's loss. Yet the disaster also serves as a timeless reminder that human technology, no matter how advanced, remains vulnerable to the forces of nature and the consequences of human error. The unsinkable ship's fate demonstrates that overconfidence and complacency can transform minor hazards into major catastrophes, a lesson that applies far beyond maritime travel. As we leave the icy waters where the Titanic found her eternal rest, our journey continues to disasters that, while receiving less attention than the famous White Star liner, claimed even more lives. In the warm waters of the Philippines, we encounter a tragedy that demonstrates how overcrowding, poor regulation, and inadequate safety measures can create maritime disasters that dwarf even the Titanic in their human cost. The passenger ferry Doña Paz pushed through the calm, tropical waters between Leyte and Manila on the evening of December 20th, 1987, carrying what would become one of the largest concentrations of human life ever lost in a single maritime disaster. The aging vessel, built in Japan in 1963, had been pressed into service connecting the scattered islands of the Philippines, where millions of people depended on ferries for transportation between remote communities and urban centers. Captain Amelito Abad guided his heavily loaded ship through familiar waters, following routes that passenger ferries had navigated for decades. The Doña Paz represented the backbone of inter-island transportation in the Philippines, where thousands of islands created a society that lived and died by maritime connections. For many passengers aboard that night, ferry travel was not a luxury but a necessity, the only affordable way to reach family, work, or medical care. The ship's official capacity was listed as 1,494 passengers, but like many ferries operating in developing regions, the Doña Paz routinely carried far more people than regulations allowed. Overcrowding had become so common that authorities often turned a blind eye to violations, prioritizing transportation needs over safety considerations. Passengers slept in corridors, on deck chairs, and anywhere they could find space. That December evening, the ferry carried an estimated 4,386 people, nearly 3 times her official capacity. The passenger manifest was incomplete and inaccurate, making it impossible to know exactly how many souls were aboard. Many passengers purchased tickets at the last minute, while others traveled without proper documentation, seeking the cheapest possible transportation. The overcrowding created dangerous conditions throughout the ship. Emergency equipment became inaccessible, blocked by passengers and their belongings. Life jackets were insufficient in number and often stored in locations that passengers could not reach. Escape routes were clogged with people and cargo, making emergency evacuation nearly impossible even under the best circumstances. As night fell over the Tabla Strait, another vessel was approaching from the opposite direction. The oil tanker Vector, carrying 8,800 barrels of petroleum products, was making her way toward Manila under the command of Captain Reynaldo Gualon. The tanker, built in 1960, represented another example of aging maritime infrastructure pressed into service beyond its optimal operational life. The Vector carried a cargo that would transform what might have been a survivable collision into a catastrophic inferno. Gasoline, kerosene, and other petroleum products filled her tanks, creating a floating bomb that needed only a spark to unleash devastating destruction. Maritime regulations required special precautions when transporting such dangerous cargo, but enforcement was often lax in Philippine waters. Neither ship carried modern radar equipment or sophisticated navigation systems. Communication between vessels relied on visual signals and radio equipment that was often unreliable or improperly maintained. The tropical night was clear, but the absence of modern safety technology meant that collision avoidance depended primarily on watchkeeping and seamanship skills. At approximately 10:30 in the evening, the two ships collided with tremendous force in the waters near Marinduque Island. The impact tore open both vessels, instantly spilling thousands of gallons of petroleum products into the sea. The volatile cargo ignited almost immediately, creating a massive fireball that engulfed both ships and spread across the surrounding water. The collision and resulting fire created an apocalyptic scene in the tropical darkness. Flames rose hundreds of feet into the air, visible for miles across the calm sea. The petroleum fire burned with intense heat that made rescue attempts extremely dangerous, while toxic smoke created additional hazards for anyone attempting to approach the disaster site. Passengers aboard the Doña Paz found themselves trapped in a nightmare of fire, smoke, and panic. The ship's overcrowded conditions made orderly evacuation impossible, while the petroleum fire spread rapidly across the vessel's decks and superstructure. Many people faced the terrible choice between remaining aboard a burning ship or jumping into flaming water. The ferry's inadequate safety equipment became tragically apparent as the disaster unfolded. Life jackets were either unavailable or inaccessible to most passengers. Lifeboats could not be launched due to the intense heat and flames surrounding the ship. Emergency lighting failed quickly, plunging much of the vessel into darkness as fires raged above and below decks. Many passengers were trapped in interior compartments where smoke and toxic fumes created deadly conditions within minutes. The ship's ventilation system, designed for tropical comfort, became a network for spreading poisonous gases throughout the vessel. Families were separated in the chaos, with children and elderly passengers particularly vulnerable to the rapidly developing emergency. The Vector's crew faced their own desperate situation as fire consumed their tanker. The petroleum cargo that had created the inferno also made their ship a continuing source of fuel for the flames. Several crew members were killed in the initial collision, while others faced the same terrible choice between fire and water that confronted the ferry passengers. Rescue efforts were hampered by the intensity of the fire and the remote location of the collision. Coast Guard vessels and nearby ships that responded to distress calls found themselves unable to approach close enough to rescue survivors. The petroleum fire created a zone of destruction that extended far beyond the ships themselves, making water rescue extremely dangerous. The few survivors who managed to escape the burning vessels found themselves struggling in water contaminated with burning petroleum. Many suffered severe burns from flaming fuel that floated on the surface. Others succumbed to smoke inhalation or drowning before rescue vessels could reach them through the fire and debris. Commercial fishing boats in the area provided the most effective rescue efforts, their smaller size and local knowledge allowing them to navigate closer to the disaster site than larger vessels. These brave fishermen risked their own lives pulling survivors from the burning water, often suffering burns and smoke inhalation in the process. The Philippine Coast Guard coordinated rescue operations from a distance, but their capabilities were limited by equipment shortages and the unprecedented scale of the disaster. Military vessels joined the effort as word of the tragedy spread, but the fire's intensity and the contaminated water made rescue attempts extremely hazardous. As dawn broke over the Tablas Strait, the full scope of the disaster became apparent. Both ships had burned completely and sunk, leaving only debris and oil slicks to mark the location of the tragedy. The death toll appeared staggering, though the exact number of victims would never be known due to incomplete passenger records and the complete destruction of both vessels. Official casualty figures listed 1,749 confirmed deaths, but maritime experts and government officials acknowledged that the actual toll was likely much higher. The informal nature of ferry travel in the Philippines meant that many passengers had no official record of their journey, making accurate casualty counts impossible. Only 26 people survived the disaster, rescued from the burning water by fishing boats and other vessels that managed to approach the fire zone. The survivors' accounts provided harrowing testimony about the overcrowding, inadequate safety equipment, and chaotic conditions that had transformed a routine ferry trip into an unimaginable tragedy. Investigation into the disaster revealed systemic problems in Philippine maritime safety regulation and enforcement. The Doña Paz had been operating with expired safety certificates and insufficient life-saving equipment. Overcrowding violations were routine and ignored by authorities who prioritized transportation access over passenger safety. The Vector's safety record also showed numerous violations and maintenance issues that had been overlooked by regulatory authorities. The tanker's cargo handling procedures did not meet international standards for transporting petroleum products, particularly in waters where passenger vessels operated regularly. Corruption within the maritime regulatory system had created an environment where safety violations were tolerated in exchange for bribes or political influence. Ship owners found it cheaper to pay fines or corrupt officials than to maintain their vessels properly or comply with safety regulations. The disaster highlighted the broader challenges facing developing nations in balancing transportation needs with safety requirements. The Philippines' geography created enormous demand for inter-island ferry service, but limited resources and weak governance made it difficult to maintain adequate safety standards. International maritime organizations responded to the tragedy by offering technical assistance and safety training programs. However, implementing meaningful reforms required addressing deeper issues of poverty, corruption, and inadequate infrastructure that extended far beyond maritime transportation. The families of victims faced additional tragedy in the aftermath of the disaster. Many victims' bodies were never recovered, making funeral arrangements and insurance claims extremely difficult. Compensation for families was minimal, leaving many survivors in desperate financial circumstances. The Philippine government promised sweeping reforms in ferry safety regulations following the disaster, but progress was slow and often incomplete. Limited budgets, political instability, and resistance from ferry operators made implementing new safety requirements extremely challenging. The Doña Paz tragedy demonstrated how poverty and weak governance could transform routine transportation into deadly gambles with human life. The disaster showed that maritime safety was not just a technical issue, but a reflection of broader social and economic conditions that affected millions of people throughout the developing world. Years after the tragedy, ferry safety in the Philippines remained problematic, with regular accidents and safety violations continuing to claim lives. The lessons of the Doña Paz disaster seemed to fade from public memory as other crises captured attention, leaving underlying problems largely unaddressed. The disaster also highlighted the vulnerability of traditional communities that depended on maritime transportation for survival. When safety systems failed, the consequences fell most heavily on the poor and marginalized people who had few alternatives to dangerous ferry services. International shipping organizations used the Doña Paz tragedy as a case study in maritime safety management, demonstrating how multiple system failures could combine to create disasters of unprecedented scale. The lessons learned influenced safety protocols and training programs worldwide. The tragedy remains the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history, surpassing even famous disasters like the Titanic in terms of lives lost. Yet the Doña Paz remains largely unknown outside maritime safety circles, overshadowed by disasters that occurred in wealthier nations with better media coverage. As we leave the warm waters of the Philippines, where so many lives were lost in flames and smoke, our journey continues to the cold Baltic Sea and another ferry disaster that would shock the developed world. In European waters, modern safety systems and wealthy nations would prove insufficient to prevent tragedy when design flaws met violent weather in the darkness of a September night. The passenger ferry Estonia steamed through increasingly rough Baltic waters on the night of September 27, 1994, carrying 989 passengers and crew from Tallinn to Stockholm on what should have been a routine overnight crossing. The modern ferry represented the pride of Estonian maritime service, a symbol of the newly independent nation's reconnection with Western Europe after decades of Soviet occupation. Captain Arvo Andresen commanded the Estonia as she pushed through mounting swells generated by a powerful autumn storm system moving across the Baltic Sea. The ferry's passengers settled into their cabins or enjoyed the ship's restaurants and entertainment facilities, confident in the vessel's modern safety systems and the crew's ability to handle the deteriorating weather conditions. The Estonia embodied late 20th century ferry design, built in 1980 for service in the challenging Baltic environment. At 515 feet long and capable of carrying over 2,000 people, she featured modern navigation equipment, comprehensive safety systems, and the robust construction needed for year-round operation in northern waters where storms could generate dangerous sea conditions. The ship's bow visor, a massive steel structure that protected the car deck during loading and unloading operations, was secured for sea by hydraulic locks and mechanical latches designed to withstand the forces generated by heavy weather. This critical component allowed the ferry to carry vehicles while maintaining watertight integrity, but its complex design created potential failure points that would prove catastrophic. As the evening progressed, the storm intensified with winds reaching gale force and waves building to heights that challenged even experienced ferry crews. The Estonia encountered seas with wave heights exceeding 12 feet, creating tremendous stresses on her hull structure and bow visor assembly. The ship's motion became increasingly violent as she battled through the storm. Passengers aboard the ferry experienced the rough weather as uncomfortable but not particularly alarming. Modern ferries were designed to handle severe Baltic storms, and the Estonia's reputation for reliability gave travelers confidence in their safety. Many passengers retired to their cabins early, seeking relief from the ship's motion in their beds. Unknown to those aboard, the storm was subjecting the bow visor to forces beyond its design limits. The repeated impact of heavy seas against the visor's forward face created metal fatigue and stress concentrations that gradually weakened the attachment mechanisms. Each wave strike added to the cumulative damage that would ultimately lead to catastrophic failure. At approximately 1 in the morning on September 28th, passengers and crew heard loud metallic noises coming from the forward part of the ship. These sounds, described as banging or hammering, indicated that something was seriously wrong with the bow structure. However, the storm's noise and the ship's normal operating sounds initially masked the severity of the developing problem. The bow visor's locking mechanisms began failing under the relentless pounding of the heavy seas. Hydraulic systems that held the massive steel structure in place were overwhelmed by forces that exceeded their design capacity. Metal fatigue, corrosion, and inadequate maintenance combined with the storm's power to create a cascading failure of critical safety systems. First Officer Tommy Ainsalu, investigating reports of unusual noises from the bow area, discovered that the bow visor was moving independently of the ship's hull. The massive structure, weighing over 50 tons, had partially separated from its mounting points and was being driven back and forth by the storm waves. This movement created additional stress on the remaining attachments and threatened complete separation. Captain Anderson, alerted to the developing crisis, ordered course and speed changes designed to reduce the stress on the damaged bow structure. However, the storm's power and the ferry's need to maintain sufficient speed for steering control limited the options available to the crew. The ship was caught between the need to reduce wave impact and the requirement to maintain maneuverability. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, the bow visor tore completely away from the ship, taking with it the watertight integrity of the car deck. The loss of the visor exposed the ferry's interior to the full force of the Baltic storm, allowing thousands of tons of seawater to pour into the vehicle storage areas with each wave that struck the ship. The sudden loss of the bow visor and the massive water ingress that followed created an immediate emergency that overwhelmed the Estonia's ability to survive. Water poured into the car deck faster than the ship's pumps could remove it, creating a progressive flooding situation that quickly became irreversible. The ferry began developing a severe list to starboard as water accumulated on the lower decks. The disaster unfolded with terrifying speed as the ship's stability deteriorated rapidly. Within minutes of the bow visor's loss, the Estonia had developed such a severe list that normal movement aboard became nearly impossible. Passengers found themselves sliding across tilted corridors while furniture and equipment broke loose and became dangerous projectiles. Emergency procedures proved inadequate for the severity and speed of the developing disaster. The ship's public address system failed early in the emergency, leaving passengers without guidance or information about evacuation procedures. Crew members, many of whom were thrown from their beds by the ship's sudden list, struggled to reach emergency stations and organize rescue efforts. The Estonia's severe list made launching lifeboats from the port side impossible, while boats on the starboard side faced the challenge of being launched into heavy seas that immediately threatened to swamp them. Many passengers found themselves trapped in tilted corridors or cabins where escape became increasingly difficult as the ship's angle increased. Third engineer Margus True, working in the engine room when the disaster began, heroically remained at his post to maintain power and emergency systems as long as possible. His efforts kept the ship's lights burning and emergency equipment functioning during the crucial early minutes of the crisis, providing vital assistance to evacuation efforts. The ferry's list increased so rapidly that many passengers had no time to reach muster stations or lifeboats before the vessel became uninhabitable. Some people found themselves forced to climb across nearly vertical surfaces to reach areas where escape might be possible. Others became trapped in lower deck areas that flooded before they could escape. Radio distress calls from the Estonia alerted rescue services throughout the Baltic region to the unfolding tragedy. Coast Guard vessels, military ships, and commercial vessels in the area responded immediately, but the storm conditions that had caused the disaster also made rescue operations extremely dangerous and difficult. The Estonia's final moments came shortly before 2 in the morning when the ship's list exceeded 90 degrees and she capsized completely. The ferry then sank rapidly in the deep waters of the Baltic Sea, taking with her most of the people who had been trapped aboard. The entire sequence from bow visor loss to final sinking took less than 30 minutes. Rescue operations in the storm-tossed Baltic waters became a desperate search for survivors among waves that reached heights of 15 feet. Helicopters battled severe weather conditions to reach the disaster site, while surface vessels struggled through dangerous seas to locate and rescue people who had managed to escape the sinking ferry. The Swedish Coast Guard coordinated the massive rescue effort, deploying multiple helicopters, ships, and aircraft to search the wide area where survivors might be found. Finnish rescue services also participated, contributing vessels and aircraft to the international effort despite the challenging weather conditions. The cold Baltic water, with temperatures around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, created an additional threat to survival that rescue crews had to overcome. Hypothermia could kill within hours even for survivors wearing life jackets, making rapid rescue essential for anyone who had escaped the sinking ship. Of the 989 people aboard the Estonia, only 137 survived the disaster. Most survivors were rescued from life rafts or were found floating in life jackets, having somehow managed to escape the ship before she sank. The high casualty rate reflected both the speed of the sinking and the challenging rescue conditions. Investigation into the disaster began immediately, with multiple nations participating in efforts to determine the cause of the bow visor failure. The investigation faced unique challenges because the wreck lay in deep water and the bow visor had separated from the ship, requiring extensive underwater surveys to understand the failure sequence. The official investigation concluded that metal fatigue and design deficiencies in the bow visor's attachment system had caused the catastrophic failure. The investigators found that the visor's locks were inadequate for the forces generated by severe weather and that maintenance procedures had not detected the developing fatigue cracks that led to failure. The disaster prompted immediate safety improvements for similar ferries operating throughout northern European waters. New regulations required strengthened bow visor designs, improved attachment systems, and enhanced monitoring equipment to detect developing structural problems before they became catastrophic. Controversy surrounded some aspects of the investigation, with alternative theories suggesting that the ship might have struck a submarine or been damaged by an explosion. However, the official findings attributing the disaster to structural failure remained the accepted explanation, supported by extensive technical analysis of the wreckage and survivor testimony. The Estonia disaster had profound impacts on ferry safety regulations throughout Europe. New requirements for watertight integrity, emergency procedures, and structural monitoring were implemented to prevent similar failures. The tragedy also highlighted the need for better crew training and passenger safety education. Families of the victims faced additional trauma when authorities decided to declare the wreck site a maritime grave and prohibited further salvage or recovery operations. This decision, while respecting the dignity of those who died, prevented closure for many families who hoped to recover remains of their loved ones. The disaster also exposed weaknesses in Baltic Sea rescue coordination and equipment. International agreements were strengthened to improve cooperation between rescue services, while new equipment and training programs were implemented to enhance capabilities for operations in severe weather conditions. Memorial services and monuments in Estonia, Sweden, and Finland commemorate the victims of the disaster and serve as reminders of the importance of maritime safety. The tragedy became a defining moment for the newly independent Estonia, demonstrating both the nation's vulnerability and its resilience in the face of catastrophe. The Estonia wreck remains on the bottom of the Baltic Sea, protected by international agreement and serving as a grave site for the 852 people who died in the disaster. The site continues to be monitored to ensure that it remains undisturbed while providing valuable data about deep water preservation of shipwrecks. Modern ferry designs incorporate lessons learned from the Estonia disaster, with improved bow door systems, better watertight subdivision, and enhanced stability characteristics. These improvements represent a direct legacy of the tragedy, helping to ensure that similar disasters cannot occur in the future. As we leave the cold Baltic waters where the Estonia found her grave, our journey continues from passenger ferries to cargo vessels, where different challenges await mariners who face the ocean's power. In warmer waters but no less dangerous conditions, we encounter a modern cargo ship that would demonstrate how even contemporary vessels with advanced technology can still fall victim to the eternal struggle between human judgment and nature's fury. The cargo ship El Faro departed Jacksonville, Florida on September 29, 2015, bound for San Juan, Puerto Rico, with a crew of 33 experienced mariners and a cargo hold filled with containers, trailers, and automobiles. Captain Michael Davidson commanded the vessel on what should have been a routine run along a shipping route he had traveled countless times, connecting the mainland United States with Puerto Rico through regular cargo service. The El Faro represented a workhorse of American maritime commerce, a converted cargo ship built in 1975 that had been serving Caribbean routes for decades. At 790 feet long and capable of carrying both containers and wheeled cargo, she provided essential transportation links for Puerto Rico's economy, delivering everything from food and medicine to automobiles and industrial equipment. As the ship departed Florida waters, weather forecasters were tracking a tropical disturbance in the Atlantic that would soon develop into Hurricane Joaquin. The storm system was still organizing and its ultimate path remained uncertain, but meteorologists warned that it could intensify rapidly and pose a threat to shipping in the southwestern Atlantic and Caribbean regions. Captain Davidson and his officers reviewed weather reports and storm projections as they planned their route to Puerto Rico. The ship's intended track would take her through waters that might be affected by the developing hurricane, but the storm's predicted path initially seemed to allow for safe passage if timing and routing were carefully managed. The El Faro carried modern navigation and communication equipment, including satellite weather data systems that provided real-time updates on storm development and movement. However, the ship also relied on older technologies and procedures that had served cargo vessels reliably for decades, creating a blend of modern and traditional approaches to maritime navigation. The crew aboard the El Faro were experienced professionals who had weathered many storms during their careers at sea. Chief Mate Stephen Schultz, Second Mate Danielle Randolph, and the other officers brought decades of combined experience in Caribbean shipping operations. The engineering staff, led by Chief Engineer Richard Pusatere, maintained the ship's aging but serviceable machinery with skill and dedication. As the ship proceeded southward, Hurricane Joaquin continued to strengthen and organize into a more dangerous storm system. Weather updates received aboard the El Faro showed the hurricane developing into a major storm with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour, creating extremely dangerous conditions for any vessel that might encounter its fury. The storm's path remained uncertain, with different forecast models predicting various tracks that could take Joaquin toward the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, or out to sea. This uncertainty created a challenging decision-making environment for Captain Davidson, who had to balance schedule requirements with safety considerations while working with incomplete information about the storm's future behavior. On the morning of October 1st, the El Faro encountered increasingly rough seas as Hurricane Joaquin moved closer to the ship's position. Weather conditions deteriorated rapidly, with winds reaching hurricane force and waves building to heights that challenged even experienced cargo vessels. The ship began experiencing the violent motion characteristic of vessels caught in major storm systems. Captain Davidson faced a critical decision about whether to continue toward Puerto Rico or seek shelter until the hurricane passed. Changing course would delay the ship's arrival and disrupt cargo schedules, while continuing forward meant risking encounter with the storm's most dangerous quadrants. The pressure to maintain shipping schedules competed with seamanship judgment about safety. The ship's aging mechanical systems began showing signs of stress as the El Faro battled through increasingly violent seas. The vessel had been well maintained throughout her long career, but decades of service in demanding Caribbean routes had taken their toll on her machinery and structural components. Storm conditions would test every system aboard to its limits. Engineering reports from the ship indicated problems with the propulsion system as the vessel struggled through heavy seas. The ship lost propulsion power at a critical moment when engine thrust was essential for maintaining control and steering through dangerous wave conditions. Without adequate power, the El Faro became vulnerable to the storm's full force. The ship's crew worked heroically to restore propulsion while battling increasingly desperate conditions. Chief Engineer Pusateri and his team struggled to repair critical machinery while the vessel rolled and pitched violently in hurricane-force seas. Their efforts took place in engine room conditions that became increasingly dangerous as the storm intensified. Communications from the El Faro became increasingly urgent as the crew reported their deteriorating situation to shore-based support personnel. The ship's last messages indicated that she had developed a severe list and was taking on water, suggesting that hull integrity had been compromised by the storm's violence or mechanical failures. The vessel's final communication came at approximately 7:30 in the morning on October 1st, when the crew reported abandoning ship into life rafts. After that transmission, the El Faro vanished into Hurricane Joaquin's fury, leaving only questions about what had happened during the ship's final hours as she battled the storm. Coast Guard search and rescue operations began immediately, but Hurricane Joaquin's continuing presence made initial search efforts extremely dangerous. Rescue aircraft and vessels had to wait for the storm to pass before they could safely search the area where the El Faro had last been heard from. The delay frustrated rescue coordinators but was necessary for the safety of rescue personnel. When search operations finally commenced, Coast Guard aircraft found debris and one badly damaged life raft, but no survivors from the 33-person crew. The discovery of the empty life raft suggested that the crew had attempted to abandon ship but had been overcome by the hurricane's violence before rescue could arrive. The search for the El Faro's wreck began using sophisticated deep-water search equipment, including autonomous underwater vehicles capable of exploring the ocean floor at depths exceeding 15,000 feet. The search faced challenges from the storm's aftermath and the difficulty of locating a relatively small object in the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Naval Sea Systems Command located the wreck of the El Faro in October 2015, lying in over 15,000 feet of water northeast of the Bahamas. The ship had sunk in an area where the ocean floor plunged to extraordinary depths, making recovery operations extremely challenging and expensive. The wreck's condition provided clues about the vessel's final moments. Investigation into the disaster focused on recovering the ship's voyage data recorder, often called the Black Box, which contained audio recordings from the bridge during the ship's final hours. This device, similar to aircraft flight recorders, promised to provide unprecedented insight into the decision-making process that led to the tragedy. The recovery of the voyage data recorder required sophisticated deep-sea technology and months of careful planning. The device was eventually retrieved from the wreck site and provided investigators with audio recordings of the crew's conversations and activities during the ship's encounter with Hurricane Joaquin. Analysis of the bridge recordings revealed the complex factors that contributed to the disaster, including weather routing decisions, mechanical failures, and the crew's response to rapidly deteriorating conditions. The recordings provided a heartbreaking but valuable window into how experienced mariners struggled with an impossible situation. The investigation found that Captain Davidson had made the decision to proceed through an area where Hurricane Joaquin was predicted to pass, believing that the ship could transit the region before the storm arrived. However, the hurricane's path and timing differed from forecasts, placing the El Faro directly in the storm's path at the worst possible moment. Mechanical failures, particularly with the ship's propulsion system, left the vessel unable to maneuver effectively when engine power was most critically needed. The investigation revealed that aging machinery and deferred maintenance had created vulnerabilities that became catastrophic when combined with the hurricane's violence. The disaster also highlighted challenges in weather routing and storm prediction that affect modern shipping operations. While weather forecasting has improved dramatically, hurricanes can still change course and intensity in ways that surprise meteorologists and mariners. The uncertainty inherent in storm prediction creates ongoing challenges for vessel routing decisions. The El Faro tragedy demonstrated that even modern ships with experienced crews remain vulnerable to the ocean's power when multiple factors combine unfavorably. The disaster showed that mechanical reliability, weather prediction accuracy, and human decision-making all play critical roles in maritime safety. The investigation's findings led to recommendations for improved weather routing procedures, enhanced maintenance standards for aging vessels, and better training for mariners in hurricane avoidance techniques. These recommendations reflected lessons learned from the detailed analysis of the ship's final voyage. The families of the El Faro's crew members faced the additional trauma of losing loved ones in a disaster that might have been prevented with different decisions or better luck with mechanical systems. The investigation's findings provided some answers about what happened, but could not bring back the experienced mariners who died in the storm. The disaster also raised questions about the continued operation of aging cargo vessels in challenging environments. The El Faro was 40 years old at the time of her loss, representing many ships in the American merchant fleet that continue operating well beyond their original design lives. Memorial services for the El Faro's crew emphasized their professionalism and dedication to their duties even in the face of impossible conditions. The bridge recordings revealed crew members working together courageously as their situation became hopeless, maintaining their commitment to seamanship traditions even as their ship was overcome by the storm. The tragedy served as a reminder that the sea remains an unforgiving environment where human technology and experience can still prove inadequate when faced with nature's full power. The El Faro's loss demonstrated that vigilance, preparation, and respect for the ocean's dangers remain essential for maritime safety. As we leave the storm-tossed waters where the El Faro met her fate, our journey takes us beneath the surface to the silent world of submarines, where different dangers await those who venture into the ocean's depths. In the hidden realm below the waves, we encounter vessels designed for stealth and warfare, where the consequences of mechanical failure or human error are measured not in minutes, but in seconds, and where rescue is often impossible. The submarine USS Scorpion slipped beneath the Atlantic waves on May 21, 1968, beginning what would become her final patrol in the shadowy world of Cold War naval operations. The nuclear-powered attack submarine carried 99 officers and crew members on a mission that reflected the hidden tensions between superpowers, where submarines prowled the ocean depths, gathering intelligence and maintaining the delicate balance of nuclear deterrence. Commander Francis Slattery guided his boat through familiar waters as the Scorpion departed Norfolk Naval Base for what was scheduled to be a routine deployment to the Mediterranean Sea. The submarine represented the cutting edge of American naval technology, a nuclear-powered hunter capable of remaining submerged for months while conducting surveillance operations against Soviet naval forces. The Scorpion's mission took her into waters where American and Soviet submarines played a deadly game of cat and mouse, tracking each other's movements and testing technological capabilities in an underwater world hidden from public view. These operations carried inherent risks, as submarines operating at the limits of their performance could face mechanical failures or human errors with catastrophic consequences. The submarine's nuclear reactor provided virtually unlimited underwater endurance, freeing her from the need to surface for air or battery charging that had limited earlier submarines. This capability allowed extended patrols in hostile waters, but it also meant that nuclear submarines operated far from help when problems developed. Self-sufficiency was both their greatest strength and their ultimate vulnerability. As the Scorpion proceeded eastward across the Atlantic, her crew followed procedures developed through years of Cold War operations. Sonar operators listened for enemy submarines, while communications specialists maintained contact with shore-based commanders who directed the submarine's movements based on intelligence requirements and strategic considerations. The submarine's last confirmed communication came on May 21st, when she reported her position southwest of the Azores Islands. After that transmission, the Scorpion vanished into the ocean's depths, leaving no trace of her fate or the circumstances that led to her loss. The submarine simply disappeared, becoming one of the Cold War's most enduring mysteries. Navy search operations began when the Scorpion failed to arrive at her scheduled destination. Aircraft and surface vessels scoured the Atlantic for any sign of the missing submarine, while other submarines joined the search using sonar equipment capable of detecting underwater contacts. The search revealed nothing but empty ocean where the Scorpion should have been. The investigation into the Scorpion's loss faced unique challenges created by the classified nature of submarine operations and the Cold War environment. Military officials could not publicly discuss the submarine's mission or the waters where she had been operating without revealing sensitive intelligence capabilities and compromising ongoing operations. Months after the submarine's disappearance, deep-sea search equipment located the wreck of the Scorpion lying in over 10,000 feet of water on the Atlantic Ocean floor. The submarine had been crushed by enormous water pressure, indicating that she had suffered a catastrophic hull breach that allowed the ocean to destroy her internal compartments instantaneously. Analysis of the wreckage revealed that the Scorpion had broken into several sections, suggesting that the submarine had imploded when her pressure hull failed. The violence of the implosion had scattered debris across the ocean floor, making it difficult for investigators to determine the exact sequence of events that led to the disaster. Several theories emerged to explain the Scorpion's loss, each reflecting different aspects of submarine operations and the hazards faced by nuclear-powered vessels. Torpedo malfunctions, reactor accidents, enemy action, and structural failures all received consideration as investigators struggled to understand what had happened in the submarine's final moments. The most widely accepted theory suggested that a torpedo had exploded inside the submarine, either due to a malfunction or an accidental activation of its warhead. Such an explosion would have been instantly fatal to the crew and could have breached the pressure hull, allowing the ocean to crush the submarine's remaining structure. Soviet involvement in the submarine's loss remained a persistent theory, given the Cold War tensions and the Scorpion's intelligence-gathering mission. Some investigators suggested that Soviet forces might have detected and attacked the American submarine, though no conclusive evidence supported this possibility. The secretive nature of submarine warfare made verification extremely difficult. The families of the Scorpion's crew faced the additional burden of uncertainty about their loved one's fate. The classified nature of the investigation meant that many details about the submarine's loss could not be shared publicly, leaving relatives with unanswered questions about what had happened during the boat's final patrol. 3 decades later, another submarine disaster would demonstrate that the dangers of underwater operations transcended national boundaries and political systems. The Russian nuclear submarine Kursk departed her base in the Barents Sea on August 10, 2000, carrying 118 officers and crew members for naval exercises designed to demonstrate Russian naval capabilities. Captain Gennady Lyakhin commanded the Kursk, one of Russia's most advanced nuclear submarines and a symbol of the nation's continuing naval power, despite the economic difficulties that followed the Soviet Union's collapse. The submarine represented the pinnacle of Russian naval engineering, capable of carrying both conventional and nuclear weapons while operating at depths and speeds that challenged Western naval technology. The Kursk participated in major naval exercises involving multiple surface ships and submarines, demonstrating tactical procedures and weapons systems in realistic training scenarios. These exercises provided valuable training for Russian naval forces while showcasing military capabilities to both domestic and international observers. On August 12th, during a simulated attack exercise, the Kursk suffered a catastrophic explosion that destroyed much of her forward compartments and killed most of her crew instantly. The explosion was so powerful that it registered on seismic monitoring stations across northern Europe, initially leading some observers to suspect that a nuclear weapon had detonated. The submarine sank to the bottom of the Barents Sea, coming to rest in relatively shallow water that should have made rescue operations possible. However, the explosion had caused such extensive damage that the submarine's nuclear reactor emergency systems activated, sealing off surviving crew members from potential rescue access points. Russian naval forces began rescue operations immediately, but their efforts were hampered by equipment failures and the extent of damage to the submarine's hull. International offers of assistance were initially rejected as Russian officials insisted they could handle the emergency with their own resources. The delay in accepting international help proved fatal for any crew members who might have survived the initial explosion. By the time foreign rescue equipment reached the disaster site, all crew members had died from carbon dioxide poisoning or other effects of being trapped in the damaged submarine. Investigation into the Kursk disaster revealed that a torpedo had exploded in the submarine's forward compartment, apparently due to a fuel leak that created explosive vapors. The torpedo's detonation triggered secondary explosions of other weapons stored in the same area, creating the massive blast that destroyed the submarine's forward section. The disaster exposed serious deficiencies in Russian naval safety procedures and emergency response capabilities. The The torpedo that caused the explosion used an unstable fuel mixture that had been known to cause problems in earlier incidents, yet the weapons continued to be used despite their dangerous characteristics. The Kursk tragedy also highlighted the challenges facing the Russian military in the post-Soviet era, when reduced funding and maintenance problems affected equipment reliability and safety procedures. Economic constraints had forced delays in modernizing weapon systems and updating safety protocols, creating conditions that contributed to the disaster. International criticism of Russia's initial refusal to accept rescue assistance reflected broader concerns about transparency and cooperation in maritime emergency operations. The delay in allowing foreign help possibly cost lives that might have been saved with faster response times and better equipment. The families of the Kursk's crew members faced additional trauma when Russian officials initially provided conflicting information about the disaster and the possibility of survivors. The submarine's nuclear reactor also created fears about radiation contamination, though these concerns proved unfounded when the reactor was secured safely. Both submarine disasters demonstrated the unique risks faced by nuclear-powered vessels operating in hostile environments. Unlike surface ships, submarines have no ability to abandon ship when emergencies develop, leaving crews entirely dependent on their vessel's integrity and their own training to survive equipment failures or combat damage. The investigation into both disasters also revealed how national security considerations could complicate accident investigations and emergency response operations. Military officials' reluctance to share sensitive information sometimes hindered efforts to understand what had happened and prevented improvements that might save lives in future incidents. The secrecy surrounding submarine operations meant that many lessons learned from these tragedies could not be shared widely, limiting their value for improving maritime safety in general. The specialized nature of submarine operations created communities of knowledge that remained isolated from broader maritime safety efforts. Modern submarine designs incorporate safety improvements inspired by disasters like the Scorpion and Kursk losses, including better escape systems, improved weapons handling procedures, and enhanced emergency response capabilities. These advances represent direct legacies of the tragedies that claimed so many lives beneath the waves. The ocean depths that claimed these submarines and their crews remain largely inaccessible to rescue operations, making submarine service one of the most hazardous forms of maritime duty. The men who serve aboard these vessels accept risks that are unique in their severity and the limited possibilities for survival when things go wrong. Memorial services for the crews of both submarines emphasized their dedication to duty and their service to their nations, even in operations that remained classified long after their deaths. The submarine communities of both countries continue to honor these fallen mariners while working to prevent similar tragedies in the future. As we rise from the crushing depths where the Scorpion and Kursk found their graves, our journey continues to more recent submarine disasters that demonstrate the continuing dangers faced by those who venture beneath the waves. In the South Atlantic, another submarine would disappear into the ocean's depths, carrying with her lessons about the challenges facing aging submarine fleets in an era of reduced military budgets and increased operational demands. The Argentine submarine ARA San Juan slipped beneath the South Atlantic waters on November 15, 2017, beginning what would become her final patrol in the challenging waters off the coast of Argentina. The diesel-electric submarine carried 44 officers and crew members, including the first female submarine officer in Argentine naval history, on a mission that represented routine training operations for the South American nation's small but professional submarine force. Lieutenant Commander Pedro Martin Fernandez guided his boat through familiar waters as the San Juan departed her base at Mar del Plata for scheduled exercises in the South Atlantic. The submarine represented a significant portion of Argentina's naval capabilities, a German-built vessel that had served the Argentine Navy reliably for over 30 years despite increasing maintenance challenges and budget constraints. The San Juan embodied Cold War-era submarine technology, built in 1983 during an era when conventional submarines still played important roles in naval operations worldwide. Unlike nuclear-powered boats, diesel-electric submarines like the San Juan required regular surface operations to recharge their batteries and refresh their air supply, creating operational patterns that balanced stealth with mechanical necessities. The submarine's crew included Lieutenant Eliana Maria Krauchik, who had broken gender barriers by becoming the first woman to serve aboard an Argentine submarine. Her presence aboard the San Juan represented progress in military gender integration, while her experience as a weapons officer demonstrated the professional capabilities that transcended traditional gender roles in naval service. As the San Juan proceeded on her assigned patrol route, the submarine's aging mechanical systems faced the constant stresses of underwater operations. 34 years of service had taken their toll on the boat's equipment, requiring increasingly frequent maintenance and creating potential failure points that challenged the crew's technical expertise and resourcefulness. The submarine's electrical systems, critical for underwater operations, had experienced recurring problems that reflected both the vessel's age and the budget constraints facing the Argentine military. Spare parts were often difficult to obtain, forcing the crew to improvise repairs and modifications that kept essential systems functioning despite deteriorating components. On November 15th, the San Juan's crew reported a significant electrical problem that affected the submarine's battery charging system. The malfunction occurred while the boat was submerged, creating a potentially dangerous situation that required immediate attention to prevent more serious equipment failures or safety hazards. The crew followed emergency procedures to surface the submarine and assess the extent of the electrical problem. Their reports to shore-based commanders described efforts to repair the malfunction using available spare parts and technical expertise, reflecting the resourcefulness that submarine crews must demonstrate when operating far from shore support facilities. The submarine's final communication came on November 15th, when the crew reported making repairs to the electrical system and preparing to resume their patrol. The message indicated that the crew believed they had resolved the immediate problem and were ready to continue their mission. After that transmission, the San Juan vanished without further communication. Naval commanders initially attributed the loss of contact to routine communication problems that sometimes affected submarines operating in remote areas. However, as hours passed without further messages from the San Juan, concern grew that something more serious had occurred during the submarine's attempt to repair her electrical systems. Search operations began when the San Juan failed to maintain scheduled communication with her base. Argentine naval forces deployed available ships and aircraft to search the area where the submarine had last been heard from, while international assistance was requested to supplement limited domestic search capabilities. The search faced significant challenges from the vast expanse of the South Atlantic and the limited resources available to Argentine search forces. The submarine could have traveled hundreds of miles from her last known position, creating an enormous search area that strained available aircraft and surface vessels. International cooperation in the search effort demonstrated the maritime community's commitment to assisting mariners in distress regardless of national boundaries. Ships and aircraft from multiple countries joined the search, bringing specialized equipment and expertise that Argentina could not provide independently. As days passed without contact from the San Juan, hope for the crew's survival began to fade. Submarines carry limited life support supplies, and the boat's reported electrical problems could have affected systems critical for maintaining breathable air and removing toxic gases that accumulate in sealed underwater environments. The search operation evolved from a rescue mission to a recovery effort as the probability of finding survivors diminished. Specialized deep-sea search equipment was brought to the area to locate the submarine's wreck and determine what had happened during her final hours beneath the South Atlantic. Acoustic analysis of underwater monitoring data revealed evidence of an explosion in the area where the San Juan had been operating. The acoustic signature suggested a sudden, violent event that was consistent with a submarine implosion caused by catastrophic hull failure at significant depth. The discovery of acoustic evidence indicating an explosion transformed the search from looking for a missing submarine to locating a wreck on the ocean floor. Deep-sea search vehicles capable of operating at extreme depths were deployed to survey the seafloor where the San Juan was believed to have been lost. Ocean Infinity, a marine technology company specializing in deep-sea search operations, joined the effort using autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with sophisticated sonar and camera systems. These robotic submersibles could search vast areas of ocean floor while operating at depths that would be impossible for human divers. The wreck of the ARA San Juan was finally located in November 2018, 1 year after her disappearance, lying in over 3,000 feet of water on the South Atlantic seafloor. The submarine's condition confirmed that she had suffered a catastrophic implosion that killed all 44 crew members instantly. Analysis of the wreck revealed that the San Juan had imploded due to loss of structural integrity while operating at depth. The submarine's pressure hull had failed catastrophically, allowing the enormous water pressure at depth to crush the vessel's internal compartments in a fraction of a second. The investigation into the disaster focused on the electrical problems that the crew had reported during their final communication. Investigators theorized that the malfunction might have affected critical systems needed to maintain the submarine's depth control or structural integrity, leading to the catastrophic failure that destroyed the boat. Battery fires represented a particular hazard for diesel-electric submarines, as the chemical reactions could produce toxic gases and extreme heat that threatened both crew survival and structural integrity. The San Juan's reported electrical problems could have involved battery malfunctions that created conditions leading to the submarine's loss. The disaster highlighted the challenges facing aging submarine fleets operating with limited maintenance budgets and spare parts availability. The San Juan's 34 years of service had pushed the boat well beyond her original design life, creating maintenance challenges that strained both equipment and crew resources. International submarine safety experts noted that the San Juan's loss reflected broader problems affecting submarine operations worldwide, as many nations operated aging boats with inadequate maintenance support. Budget constraints often forced submarines to continue operating despite equipment deficiencies that increased operational risks. The families of the San Juan's crew faced the additional trauma of waiting over a year for confirmation of their loved one's fate. The submarine's discovery provided closure about what had happened, but could not diminish the grief of losing 44 dedicated naval personnel in a preventable tragedy. Lieutenant Krawczyk's death in the disaster represented a particular loss for advocates of gender integration in military service. Her professional competence and dedication had demonstrated women's capabilities in traditionally male military roles, making her loss both a personal tragedy and a setback for military gender equality efforts. The investigation into the San Juan disaster also revealed deficiencies in submarine rescue capabilities that affected not only Argentina, but many smaller naval forces worldwide. Limited budgets meant that specialized rescue equipment and training often received low priority until disasters demonstrated their critical importance. Memorial services for the San Juan's crew emphasized their professionalism and dedication, despite the challenging conditions they faced while operating aging equipment with limited support. The submarine community honored their sacrifice while working to prevent similar tragedies through improved maintenance standards and safety procedures. The disaster prompted reviews of submarine safety procedures and maintenance requirements throughout Latin America and other regions where aging submarine fleets continued operating with limited resources. The lessons learned from the San Juan's loss influenced policy discussions about military procurement and maintenance funding priorities. Modern submarine designs incorporate improved safety systems and materials that make catastrophic implosions less likely, but older boats like the San Juan remain vulnerable to age-related failures that can prove fatal. The challenge of maintaining aging military equipment with limited budgets continues to affect naval forces worldwide. The wreck of the ARA San Juan remains on the South Atlantic seafloor as a grave site for the 44 crew members who died in her service. The site serves as a reminder of the risks faced by submarine crews and the importance of adequate maintenance and safety procedures for underwater operations. As we rise from the depths where the San Juan found her grave, our journey approaches its conclusion with reflections on the patterns and lessons that emerge from these maritime tragedies. The ocean has claimed countless vessels and lives throughout history, but each disaster teaches us something about the eternal struggle between human ambition and the sea's vast power. As we reach the end of our journey through the ocean's most haunting mysteries and tragic disasters, patterns emerge from the depths like ghostly figures rising from sunken ships. Each vessel we have encountered, from the enigmatic Mary Celeste to the modern ARA San Juan, tells part of a larger story about humanity's relationship with the sea and the eternal struggle between human ambition and nature's overwhelming power. The ocean has served as humanity's highway, battlefield, and frontier for thousands of years, yet it remains fundamentally alien to our terrestrial existence. We venture onto its surface and beneath its waves as visitors in a realm governed by forces that dwarf our technology and humble our pride. Every ship that sails represents an act of faith in human engineering and seamanship, a calculated gamble against the sea's infinite capacity for surprise and destruction. The disasters we have explored span more than a century of maritime history, yet they reveal recurring themes that transcend the specific technologies and circumstances of their times. Human error, mechanical failure, natural forces, and institutional negligence appear again and again, sometimes in isolation, but more often in deadly combinations that overwhelm even the most sophisticated safety systems. The Mary Celeste reminds us that some maritime mysteries may never yield their secrets, no matter how advanced our investigative techniques become. Her crew's disappearance speaks to our fundamental fear of vanishing without explanation, of being swallowed by forces beyond human comprehension. The ghost ship drifting empty through calm seas represents the ocean's power to confound our understanding and challenge our assumptions about cause and effect. Fire emerges as a recurring destroyer in our maritime chronicle, from the SS Morro Castle's luxury liner Inferno to the Doña Paz disaster's petroleum-fueled apocalypse. These tragedies demonstrate how quickly floating palaces can become death traps when flames spread faster than evacuation procedures can save lives. The development of fire safety regulations, written in the blood of these disasters, shows how tragedy drives progress in maritime safety. Collisions in fog reveal the limitations of human perception and the challenges of navigating in an environment where traditional senses fail. The Empress of Ireland, Andrea Doria, and countless other vessels fell victim to the deceptive nature of reduced visibility, where ships that seemed safely separated suddenly found themselves on collision courses. Modern radar and GPS systems have reduced but not eliminated these dangers. The Titanic stands alone among maritime disasters, not because of her size or casualty count, but because of her symbolic power as a monument to human hubris. The unsinkable ship's encounter with an iceberg became a metaphor for the consequences of overconfidence and the dangers of believing that technology can conquer nature. Her legacy lives on in every lifeboat drill and safety regulation implemented since that April night in 1912. Class distinctions and social inequality appear as dark threads woven through many of these tragedies. First-class passengers on the Titanic had better survival rates than steerage travelers. The Doña Paz carried poor Filipino families who had few transportation alternatives despite the ferry's dangerous overcrowding. Maritime disasters often reflect and amplify the social inequalities that exist on land. Institutional failures compound individual tragedies when governments and companies prioritize profits over safety. The Doña Paz operated with expired safety certificates and massive overcrowding that authorities ignored. The Estonia's bow visor failed due to design deficiencies and maintenance problems that regulatory systems had not detected. These systemic failures multiply the human cost of individual accidents. The evolution of rescue capabilities tells a story of gradual progress punctuated by dramatic improvements driven by specific disasters. The Titanic's lack of sufficient lifeboats led to requirements for adequate evacuation equipment. Radio communication systems developed partly in response to maritime emergencies where ships sank beyond the range of visual distress signals. Weather remains an implacable enemy that no amount of technology can fully tame. Hurricane Joaquin destroyed the El Faro despite modern weather forecasting and satellite communications. The Baltic storm that claimed the Estonia overwhelmed engineering systems designed specifically for harsh northern waters. The sea's power to generate conditions beyond human endurance continues to humble even our most advanced vessels. Submarine disasters reveal unique aspects of maritime risk, where crews operate in an environment that offers no possibility of rescue if critical systems fail. The USS Scorpion Kursk and ARA San Juan remind us that beneath the waves, self-sufficiency is not just an advantage but a matter of life and death. When submarines fail, their crews often have seconds rather than hours to save themselves. Age and maintenance emerge as critical factors in many disasters, particularly affecting military vessels and commercial ships operating with limited budgets. The El Faro's aging machinery and the ARA San Juan's deteriorating electrical systems demonstrate how deferred maintenance can transform minor problems into catastrophic failures. The challenge of maintaining aging fleets with inadequate resources affects maritime operations worldwide. International cooperation in search and rescue operations represents one of the bright lights in our chronicle of maritime tragedy. When the Estonia sank, ships from multiple nations joined rescue efforts despite challenging weather. The search for the ARA San Juan involved international assistance that transcended political boundaries. The sea's dangers unite maritime communities in common cause. Technology's double-edged nature appears throughout these stories. Advanced navigation systems prevented some collisions while creating new types of human error when operators misinterpreted electronic displays. Nuclear propulsion freed submarines from surface dependence while creating new catastrophic failure modes. Each technological advance brings new capabilities and new vulnerabilities. The role of individual heroism shines through even the darkest maritime disasters. Radio operators who stayed at their posts while ships burned around them. Engineers who maintained power systems until the last possible moment. Crew members who helped others into lifeboats while knowing their own chances of survival were minimal. These acts of courage remind us that human character matters most when facing the sea's ultimate tests. Cultural memory shapes how maritime disasters are remembered and understood. The Titanic occupies a central place in popular consciousness, while equally tragic events like the Dona Paz remain largely unknown outside maritime circles. Fame and infamy in maritime history often depend more on media attention and cultural resonance than on the actual scale of loss or lessons learned. The sea's power to preserve and destroy creates underwater museums and graveyards that tell stories of human ambition and mortality. The Titanic wreck site has become a focus for both scientific study and commercial exploitation. The Andrea Doria attracts technical divers seeking artifacts and adventure. These underwater monuments remind us that the ocean never forgets, even when human memory fades. Environmental considerations increasingly influence how we understand and respond to maritime disasters. Oil spills from tanker accidents create pollution that outlasts the immediate human tragedy. Nuclear submarines raise concerns about radioactive contamination that extend far beyond their crew's fate. Modern maritime safety must consider not just human life, but environmental impact. The democratization of ocean travel through modern transportation has both reduced and redistributed maritime risks. Commercial aviation has largely replaced ocean liners for passenger service, but cruise ships carry millions of people annually through waters where rescue may be difficult or impossible. Cargo shipping has expanded enormously, creating new opportunities for both progress and disaster. Lessons learned from maritime disasters influence safety improvements that save countless lives, though often these advances come too late for the victims who paid the price for our education. Each tragedy teaches us something about the limits of human engineering, the importance of proper training, and the need for adequate safety equipment and procedures. The ocean's mysteries continue to capture human imagination because they represent the unknown that persists in our increasingly mapped and measured world. The sea covers most of our planet's surface, yet we know more about the surface of Mars than about the deepest ocean trenches. Every maritime disaster reminds us that we remain explorers in a realm that holds secrets we have yet to discover. Modern satellite communications and GPS navigation have transformed maritime safety, yet they cannot eliminate the fundamental risks of operating in an environment where help may be days away and where mechanical failure or human error can prove instantly fatal. The sea's basic character remains unchanged despite our technological advances. The future of maritime safety will likely depend on automation systems that reduce human error, improved materials that resist catastrophic failure, and better international cooperation in rescue operations. However, the ocean's vast scale and power ensure that maritime operations will always carry risks that test human courage and seamanship. As our journey through these maritime mysteries and disasters concludes, we are reminded that the sea remains humanity's greatest frontier and most challenging adversary. Every ship that sails, every submarine that submerges, Every ferry that connects island communities represents a continuation of the ancient human drive to explore, trade, and travel despite the ocean's dangers. The vessels we have encountered in our chronicle, from ghost ships to burning ferries to crushed submarines, serve as monuments to human ambition and memorials to those who paid the ultimate price for our mastery of the seas. Their stories remind us that progress comes through both triumph and tragedy, that safety improvements are built on the foundation of previous disasters, and that the sea will always demand respect from those who venture upon its waters. The ocean keeps its secrets jealously, releasing them only gradually to persistent investigators armed with advancing technology and deep determination. Yet, for every mystery solved, new questions emerge from the depths. The sea's capacity to surprise and humble humanity ensures that maritime mysteries will continue to captivate future generations, just as they have fascinated us throughout our exploration of lost ships and vanished souls. In the end, these maritime tragedies teach us that the relationship between humanity and the sea is one of eternal tension between our drive to explore and exploit the ocean's resources and our vulnerability to its awesome power. The sea gives life and takes it away, connects distant shores and separates loved ones, enables commerce and demands sacrifice. It remains, as it has always been, both highway and graveyard, frontier and final resting place for those who dare to challenge its depths.